Firstly, welcome everyone to the first of this year's sessions on navigating risk. For some of you might be aware, we did a couple sessions last year. The real intention is that we aim in this content at the risk practitioner who's sort of been in the role for a while. So it's not necessarily just basic standard approaches to risk, and maybe not the level of chief risk officers, but from my dealings with various people in risk, I'm sure that there may be things that I could still share with them. The session is really going to have a thread that runs through to the subsequent sessions, and the reason for the content that we've compiled across these 4 sessions is the fact that there has been some feedback during the RIMS conference earlier this year, as well as through engagements with various people. So there is some method in our madness. We do welcome any feedback that you can provide. Just helps us to get a sense of what would be meaningful to you. I think what's also critically important is in our role as risk practitioners, we may not be working as consultants or in professional services, or have be in the fortunate position to be operating with the exec and the board all the time, and consequently we may find ourselves not in the best position to respond to their requirements or be cognizant of everything that's going on in that area. And I'm hoping that these sessions that we've put together will cater for a number of these requirements. So without further ado, sorry, I'm just admitting people, I'm going to get cracking with the content. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will share the presentation in PDF form afterwards. It's always just useful for me to work through the content. So you don't need to be taking down notes. It'll all be in the presentation. But as you may have seen from past presentations that I do, there can be abbreviated content in the slides and a lot of discussion. So hopefully if this is shared more widely with people who aren't able to attend, they can at least make head or tail of what I'm sort of talking to. So let's get things underway. So the theme today is managing risks that we have no control over, and you'll see as I work through the content what I'm really angling at this. There's a little bit of a play on words, but I'm really hoping that this can still cater for your requirements and your expectations. For those of you who don't know, my name's Ross Liston. I run a company called Crucible & Co, primarily focused on risk and helping organizations deal with risk, whether it be the content or the frameworks, but I've been assisting Kerry and the RIMS board with some of these training sessions, and so I'm hoping that my experience in this field will be useful to all of you online today. Sorry. So I guess a number of you might have been fortunate enough to attend the launch of the World Economic Forum report that was published recently, that Marsh so kindly hosted, and it was sort of under the auspices of RIMS New Zealand and Pacific Island. But really what typically happens is every year, most of us that work in the sector wait for these reports to be launched. The reason why we like them is there's obviously a lot of focus on what comes out of it, and it's quite influential. And we get to find out what these mega trends are that we need to focus on. But I don't know if it's the same for you, but I often would come away from these sessions that I've been going to over the years, and I'd go, okay, well, what do we do with this information? Something that's really quite challenging is that the scope and severity of some of these risks is so large that we almost just turn a blind eye to them, or we in the risk function are sort of sidelined from where they are applied. And I'll explain what I mean by that, particularly when it comes to board level discussions. So I've been in a number of board meetings where this report pops up, people discuss it, or they've seen it at the Institute of Directors, and there's been some key aspects discussed, and we as risk practitioners are not always aware of what those conversations are. I think the other area where it's applied quite heavily is in the strategy area, when we start looking at how does an organization respond, how do we strategize going forward. On many occasions, the risk function is sort of secondary to some of those conversations, yet we'd be ideally placed to try and enrich that conversation. And then if we are in a position to deal with this information, it's how do we make it relevant to our organization? That's really where the rubber hits the road and we can add value. So what we plan to do today is that I can provide some guidance on how you can deal with these uncontrollable risks. And so You'll see during the course of this presentation, I'll explain why that is and what we can do about it. The outline for today is one, what are these uncontrollable risks and why should we be concerned about them? We'll then tackle some of the things around, well, what makes them uncontrollable? And then lastly, how can we tackle them? What can we as risk practitioners do in the business? So first and foremost, that question around what is an uncontrollable risk and why does it matter? Well, the reason why it's important is it's typically external to the organization, yet it's hugely influential on the organization. And I always go back to this model of what risk types are. It's a paper that was in Harvard Business Review by Kaplan and Mikes, and they essentially subdivide risk into three main areas. There's either the risk that we wish to sort of take on, which is the strategic risk, and it's a calculated risk, it's a calculated decision. Then there's the preventable risks, which is typically the operational risk space, and it's within the organization. And sitting right in the middle is this area of uncontrollable risk or the external environment. And you can see at the bottom, our response to these risks varies from us having some aptitude to want to pursue the risk to where we want to avoid it. So I really, this is my go-to all the time because many risk taxonomies may differ, but for me, it always comes down to these three main criteria. So what we're dealing with today is the one in the middle. So circling back to that World Economic Forum risk report, they typically will look at what are the most important risks around the globe, and they'll look at a sort of a 2-year time horizon and a 10-year time horizon. And if we look at the 2 and 10-year picture, and the bulk of them are often risks we cannot control in an organizational context. So I've circled the ones which we have some degree of control over. The remainder of them are really ones that we respond to. We can't really change what happens in terms of, involuntary migration or extreme weather events, but we can respond to them. So when we look at these reports of this nature, a lot of the content in there falls into that bracket of uncontrollable risk. And interesting enough, if you look at what the perceptions are going forward, the tendency is to think, well, it's only going to get worse. And what was quite interesting for those of you who weren't at the presentation at Marsh, the one presenter mentioned that they are now questioning whether they can use this 2 and 10-year time horizon because things are changing so rapidly, and we may well see a 2 and 5-year time horizon. So we can watch the space, but largely the sentiment is always something may be getting worse in the future. So what makes these risks uncontrollable? And this is where there's a little bit of a play on words from my side, but the first sort of answer to this is that some of these risks genuinely are either unexpected, they're catastrophic, they're existential in nature, they're either unknown, unknowable, and quite often they're interconnected. So all these factors make them quite difficult to deal with. If we look at what we're sort of speaking about, if we take a sort of traditional distribution of risks based on severity or likelihood, the left-hand side is where we have that sort of expected loss. And then sort of from the middle out to the right, we have the unexpected loss right down to sort of catastrophic losses where it's really very high levels of severity. And that's the realm of what I would consider to be uncontrollable risks. They may very well be existential in nature, and it's not a term that just gets thrown around. If you look at it, existential risks, and there's the slide to come that will probably unpack this a little bit more, but this is really extreme in nature risks that are global, they're terminal, and seem to be permanent. And interesting enough, this image is a reference to someone questioning whether the advent of AI will be an existential risk. And obviously there's diverse opinions out there, but strong beliefs that this could be a real game changer. But if we look at the model where existential risk comes from, this is from a guy called Bostrom in 2008, you can see from the left-hand side, we're now looking at scopes that are going beyond global, and they even get into transgenerational. These are things that are going to affect people into the future. And then from the severity, some of them are, terminal, and they use the term hellish, whatever that means. But when you think about how extreme that is, and you look at what's coming out of these global risk reports, you can see we're starting to sort of border on that sort of frontier of where things are now becoming existential. And as I said, AI seems to be one of the key ones, climate change, all these things are things where they believe they'll be extremely severe in nature. They won't be able to be changed, and we will need to sort of suffer the consequences unless we can respond accordingly. Another way to look at it is this sort of framework of risk being known and unknowable. And I know that some of the concern on these presentations is that we don't get too theoretical, but I'm really just picking up on some of the principles. I'm not going to delve into the real details of this area, but when we're dealing with, if I'm working from the known, sort of the certainty and known risk, when you think about something like the toss of a die, we know what the probabilities are. We just don't know when it's going to happen. We get some idea of the frequencies, and there's a number of risks in the organization where we have an appreciation for what the risk might be, but we're not entirely certain how it'll play out. And right on the other extreme is we have this sort of unidentifiable risk where we don't know what it is. Now, we can't really bring that into this discussion, because if we don't know what it is, how do we have a conversation about it? What do we put in a risk register or in front of on the risk dashboard, whatever the case may be? So what we're focusing on is this area of where there's uncertainty and ambiguity, and what we would need to do about that, because we can't put the necessary measures in place to prevent them. So just so you understand the sort of realm we're playing in, that's not to say those other risks aren't important, but it's really just to give a sense of where we're looking. The other thing, as I mentioned on that slide with, what may be happening, is that the tendencies, they might be smaller risks or a combination of bigger risks, but it's the interconnectedness. When I was still working in professional services, that was starting to become the watchword, is how do these things all relate to one another, and what do we do about them? Because we almost get a risk emerging from a combination of smaller risks. You'll also see lots of conversations around the poly crisis, the meta crisis, perma crisis, all these words that keep cropping up. And I think it's an area where we really struggle, because our tendency is to try and tackle one thing at a time, when in fact it's a combination of these things that we need to think. The diagram in the middle is what they refer to as a wicked problem. And so, where do you grab this thing, and where do you try and influence it? Because the minute you work on one area, it has a knock on to other areas. It's not just the one isolated item you want to tackle. Again, what are the kind of characteristics? Well, first of all, these global risks, or these mega risks, seem to affect everyone. I mean, obviously there will be some examples that are very localized, and I'll mention that later, but the tendencies, they're not only sort of insular to your organization. There's a higher velocity. These things seem to be happening with more speed than we've seen in the past. Intensity is greater, so you talk around these fat tails, and for those of you who are not well versed in statistics, essentially if you have a normal distribution, it's typically thinner in the middle and thinner at the ends. Fat tail means that comes down in the middle and it's fatter on the side, so the extremes are more prevalent, and that's what we're seeing quite a lot of these days. Frequency is obviously much higher. Volatility, as because of that interconnectedness, there's a compounding and a cascading. One happens which leads to others. And I think if you look at the work or the consequences of COVID is a great example, where the focus traditionally would have been on how do we manage a pandemic, a health concern. It played out into everything, supply chain, the ways of working. That's the sort of the cascading and compounding we refer to. But I think the key takeaway is that our traditional ways of managing risk, that sort of linear approach, it's not going to cut it when we talk around these risks. The second reason why it's uncontrollable, and this is this play on words that I wanted to raise, is that it's heavily dependent on what our span of control is as a risk practitioner. And, the first and foremost is this whole operating model risk, or the 3 lines model, where in the more mature organizations that are trying to create some degree of separation between line 1, or the core of the business, and line 2, which is where risk practitioners sit, there's a tendency for the main focus to be, well, we need you to just build the frameworks and we need you to provide some degree of assurance, but maybe not the 3rd line assurance. We don't always have the luxury of being able to delve into the content and really push that conversation as much as we'd like to. And so that is one area we can find ourselves being slightly isolated from where we'd like to play. A second area is if we take this sort of conceptual view of risk from right from the board all the way down into the trenches of the business and across all functions, we will often find that there are insular lenses or siloed views of risk. I'll quite often find that I might be dealing with whether it be a compliance risk or even enterprise risk, yet I'm sort of kept away from cyber risk, or I'm kept away from climate risk. And I think what's really evident is that risk doesn't adhere, if it's interconnected, risk doesn't adhere to these artificial boundaries. And when we look at something like external risks, it runs the length and breadth of the organization. It will impact every single one of those little risk domains, and we don't always have someone who's allocated that responsibility. Instead, what we might see is at some point in the calendar, we need to do a review of external risks or emerging risks, or look at the risk radar, but that's not necessarily completely folded into how we do our risk management. So that's another example of where we might be sort of sidelined. The fact that risk management, what I've shown here in orange, may be seen as completely removed from incident management, which might be isolated to the IT function or to health and safety, depending on the nature of the incident. And then when we get into the realm of business continuity, that might be something where a risk function may be separate from it, because it's, the nature of the organization. I've worked in both instances. It may be heavily sort of guarded by the data recovery, the IT space, or the realm of sort of insurance. But what tends to happen is that as risk practitioners, we don't necessarily have this completely integrated view of how we manage risk, particularly ones that we're having to respond to. And I think this is a key one to take away, is that when we're dealing these kind of risks, let's not mix up compliance with risk management. And that's not to say compliance is important, because in a operational risk world, a lot of the focal areas are compliance risks. We know what the risk is. It's manifested historically, and consequently we develop policies or legislation that needs to be put in place, and then we need to comply to that. When we move into this realm of uncontrollable risk, there isn't a defined compliance standard to adhere to. We can borrow some of the thinking and we can have the same discipline around controls, but quite often they're quite different from one another. And if we just think about it as a tick box exercise, we can be selling ourselves short in terms of how we manage these risks. So I guess this is where the rubber hits the road, is what can we do about these risks? What is the best way to focus on it? And my suggestion is just keep with the traditional risk management process, particularly the areas that I've highlighted in orange. Obviously, the monitoring and review will come into it, and the recording and the reporting, but this is really around the assessment and management up to the point that we then sort of hand over and share information more widely. And there are 2 options that you can go with. So option 1 is we can almost short circuit the process and start with the information that's available. However, we do need to make it relevant to New Zealand. And that's really key because of the fact that context is so important. In one of the previous, or probably multiple times in the previous sessions I've delivered on this forum, I've highlighted the importance of context. If you don't look at the right thing, you are heading down the wrong path to begin with, and it's not really going to help you. But in this instance, what we want to ensure is if we're going to borrow information from the likes of the World Economic Forum report or anything that comes out of the other insurers or reinsurers, we need to make sure we understand what we're dealing with. And so if I can take the view of what are the top risks globally and what are the top risks for sort of Oceania, you can see that it's quite similar. So as we come in to an area that's more relevant to our domain, the only thing that really changes is obviously the cost of living crisis has gone up in priority, whereas the misinformation and disinformation from AI and the societal and political polarization drops slightly. And then maybe right down at number 10, we've got something completely novel, whereas globally disrupted food supply chains are the issue. And then in the more localized context, it's around public debt distress. But generally, it looks the same. So using that information doesn't mean we have to make many changes in our thinking. However, the picture changes when we start to look at global to New Zealand. Now, just be mindful that the text in italics is just highlighting that in that World Economic Forum report, they do two surveys. The one is the Global Risk Perception Survey, which is done across their 1,500 individuals, and then there's the Executive Opinion, which is done over a much bigger sample size of 11,000. It's also done right down at a country level, so we can make those comparisons. And what you can note here is how different the picture is between globally what is being focused on and what is being focused on locally. And this content sits within that WEF report and is available on their website. You can go in and analyze the data. You can slice and dice it by age group. You can slice and dice by sector. But if we look at the New Zealand view, you can see how quickly, if we chased down the global avenue and we made that our focal area, we would miss some of the key things that many executives within New Zealand believe are key concerns. So I would always encourage you to delve a little deeper and not just take the stuff that is readily available. Go and find the information that is relevant to New Zealand. What this means is our traditional view of doing risk management, which is heavily around the sort of the observation and the prediction, where we're looking at what we know and what we think might crop up, etc. We are now moving into more of a forecasting role. This means that we need to be thinking a little bit further out. We need to be becoming more quantitative in the way we think about things. We're now catering for people who are planning and budgeting as opposed to just functional areas who want to make sure that they're making the right decisions. And so we need to be really aware of where our focus needs to be. So that is the option one. Option two is we need to really go and do our own homework. We need to start right back at the signals and the trends, and from that develop our own picture. And the way we do it is we're moving from that traditional role of observation and prediction to one of foresight. Now, I will say right from the get-go, foresight is clearly an area that resides more in strategy, and in fact, some organizations will even have a foresight function. So this is seldom going to be a place that we're going to play. But I think unless we are knowledgeable and understanding of what kind of logic is needed, we are going to continue to keep ourselves sidelined. And you know, in the ideal world, what I'd like to see is that risk practitioners, particularly enterprise risk, is completely folded into conversations at board and exec level, and more so at a strategic level than just risk and compliance. And so what we're looking at here with foresight is it's a much longer term view of what might be going on. We have far less certainty around what we're looking at, which is obviously going to be quite challenging for the conversations we have in the business, because people don't necessarily want us to be too wishy-washy, but we're now catering to people who are the strategizers and the innovators in the business, and where we can get involved. And I would probably say that what I'm advocating for here is not mutually exclusive. I'm not saying discard our role in the sort of observation and prediction area, but for us to be mindful of what we can access and influence is moving us in a different direction that we need to be cognizant of. So without trying to sort of flog a dead horse, again, this is a lot more work that's going into the scope and context areas so that we can adequately identify the risk. And what that looks like is you could almost, I don't know if any of you are aware, and you know, apologies if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but when you look at risk management within a business, risk management and that sort of Deming circle of plan, do, check, act, that there's like a nested cycle. It's almost like Russian nested dolls. That process repeats itself right from an enterprise level down into a functional level, down into an operational and a task level. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the same logic would apply, the gray blocks that are showing you there. Just we're asking slightly different questions. So from a context perspective, we need to say, what are the kind of questions we want to answer? And the reason why I'm saying you have to ask a question is if you don't have some idea of what you want to do, you're going to just cast the net so wide that you're going to be overwhelmed with information and not necessarily add much value. You wanting to sort of hone in on where you wanting to focus, but drill deep. And I'll use an example for you to understand the logic. Identification is then around how do we sort of conduct horizon scans, look across a range of information, completely left field in some cases, to try and formulate a picture of what the future might look like. Then conduct like a pestle analysis, or, you know, pestle, steeple. There's a range of them. What they're essentially looking at is political, environmental, social, technological, legal, environmental. You know, that's the kind of realm we wanted to slice and dice this information and have those lenses for us to think about what does this mean for our business. And then we need to evaluate, and this is where there's a sort of a two-phased approach that one follows. And the first one is what's called driver analysis, where you're trying to understand the impact of these things on the business based on the level of uncertainty around them, and I'll explain that a little bit more, and then some scenario analysis, because you've got to do all of this before you can even identify the risks themselves. We're in the realm of trend analysis before we've even got to the risk analysis. So I've got 3 slides that will talk you through this process, and I'm going to whip through it probably a little bit quicker than you would want, but as I say, it will be contained in the slide material that I shared. But as I said, you start off with those key questions. You need to define your focus. And let's say our example question is, what will it look like to do business in 2040? Now, that's still quite wide ranging, but I'm trying to just give an example that shows you how we would cascade through the thinking. We then go out there and we gather as much data as we can. And the orange asterisk is for a slide that I'm going to show you, just so you think, well, what do I do and how do I do that? You know, aside from the WEF report, there are multiple reports you can look at. So I'll speak to that a little bit more now. We need to consult stakeholders. You know, this is where quite often if you work in risk and you find difficult to get reaction or response from various people in the business, you can sit down and almost do this in a corner office and come up with some idea of a risk register, or what do we think the key risks. It's really key that we go and speak to people with diverse insights and perspective, because we're trying to imagine a future where these uncontrollable risks will be coming from or will manifest, and we cannot allow our own biases to constrain our thinking. Then we need to do this trend analysis, where we're trying to get a sense of what will be the things that shape the future, and these will be the mega trends that are transformative. They impact economies, societies, and then even cultures. And so we're trying to think, what are these big items that there is a trend, and within those trends we will pick out elements that will vary, and I'll explain an example shortly for this to make a little bit more sense. So when I talk about where you can get information, here's an example of a guy that I found on LinkedIn via someone else who works in the risk field within New Zealand. Is this person has curated over 90 trend reports. A lot of them are very focused on product innovation, but some of them are really trying to give you an idea of what this future might look like. So I encourage you to have a look at this content. It's a Google Drive. It has a whole lot of content. All these reports, you can download them, but it's a fantastic resource if you work in this realm. So you can go there and trawl through these things. I mean, as you see, you can get everything on what could be happening out in the world today and in the future and in the distant future. So that helps you to have a very wide horizon scan. Then once you've got some of that information and you've started to whittle it down, you now want to try and pick out what are those key drivers. So these are the things that are going to have the highest impact on the organization or your area of focus, and they come with the greatest degree of uncertainty. And the reason why we want to focus on that is because if they're all things we already know, we may already be tackling them. And so the example I've dealt with here, I've picked two key drivers just to explain. Climate change is one of the examples, and economic fluctuation is the other one. And then we move into the realm of scenario analysis now. Scenario analysis is quite a complicated field. There's many ways to do it. All I'm doing here is a simple 2x2 scenario analysis. And what this entails is that we take each one of those risks and we look at them or those trends, and we look at them on a continuum. What would be an optimistic view and what would be a pessimistic view? Remember, we're trying to push ourselves. We're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to create some idea of what a realistic realm would be that pushes our thinking. So taking that through, we could have 4 scenarios. So no climate change or less than we expect it to be, with economic prosperity. Second scenario is no climate change, but we do have economic hardship. Third scenario is significant climate change, but we still have economic prosperity. And then the fourth one is significant climate change with economic hardship. And we will sort of unpack what that looks like and what that means. So I'm showing on the left-hand side, I'm showing how we would be looking at the drivers that may have impact and uncertainty. Some of those will have critical uncertainty, and we know they can have a big impact and we know very little about them. And another one might be where we have some idea of how impactful it might be, but we really don't know to what extent and when that'll happen. So I've used an orange and a dark grey dot to transfer into the scenario analysis, which I described. So, you know, if driver 1 is the environment, the climate change, and driver 2 is the economy, you can get a sense of how those 4 scenarios are mapped. And then once we have each one of those scenarios, we will delve into them to understand them in more detail. And so how do we do that? How do we get from that trend right down into what is a relevant risk? So, because that's where there's higher relevance to the organization. So if we start off at the top and we have the trend or the driving force being climate change, the question we might ask is, so what? What does that mean for us? And so we drop down to using the variables that we measure climate change by, which are temperature, rainfall, etc. So in this instance, let's take temperature as being the variable. You can see I haven't decided whether I mean high, low, whatever the case may be. That comes through in the pessimistic change in the variable. I could also have the optimistic change, but I'm just explaining one example to unpack it. So we've gone from the trend being climate change. The pessimistic variable view that we'd work with is we have an increase in the number of hot days. Okay, so what? Well, what would that impact be? Well, if we have a hotter day, there will be greater demand for cooling. So you can imagine if you were an organization in a gentailer in New Zealand where you're providing energy resources or energy supply, whatever the case may be, you now need to be aware that there's going to be the risk is that you have this increased demand that you're unable to respond to. So you could also be a property developer and you've got a large retail property, and have you got enough cooling facilities? So you can see how we've gone from the trend, taken it down into the impact, and then from the impact into the risk. And so I'd encourage you to always have that thinking in mind, that we can look at a trend and immediately think that's the risk, but we don't actually know how does that relate to our organization. Now we need to analyze and evaluate that. And as I said, stopping at the trend doesn't really tell us anything. So this is where we move into the realm of analysis and evaluation, that risk process. It's all still the same process. I've done nothing different to normal. And I start with the risk assessment. And so this is the traditional part of the risk process where we're needing to assess likelihood and consequence. And ideally, we'd like to bring in speed, because we've seen that the velocity of the risk manifesting is becoming a greater concern, because a lot of these things were always on the horizon, but they're getting closer and closer. So if we can get some idea of how quickly it'll manifest, and then whether it's going to be an acute event or a chronic event or a chronic condition, that helps us to understand what we're dealing with. So the example I've done, again, I've gone with the significant climate change, but the scenario 3 being, but we still have economic prosperity. What that means is we have the ability to respond to the climate change. The technology and the economic situation is such that we can try and develop technologies, we can try and build adaptation measures to tackle it. So the direct risk we'd be trying to tackle is this rising global temperature will results in extreme weather. It can cause physical damage to assets and property and infrastructure, and it can be very disrupting. The cascading effect that we need to bear in mind, and as I said, this was what we witnessed, when we had the COVID pandemic, is that there is a knock-on effect that becomes another risk we've got to tackle. And in this instance, we're looking at, because of the increased frequency and severity of these events, there's major disruption to supply chains. Now, because I said we're in economic prosperity, we are better positioned to try and tackle these things and control them and manage them. But you could imagine that if economic prosperity, things were worse, we are hamstrung by all the options that we have available for us to respond. And then obviously, without stating the obvious, we need to then do some degree of prioritization. If we're looking at a whole range of things we want to tackle, it could be overwhelming. And if you look at how scenario analysis is done in some of these organizations and futurist and foresight organizations, they will be taking multiple scenarios and trying to play it out. We've just done the 2x2 here to keep it manageable and keep our thinking there, but you can imagine that there will be other mega trends that we need to tackle. So quite often we have this concern around, when we are capturing risks, are we capturing risks to the organization or risks from the organization? And I sort of recently compiled this matrix for one of the clients I was working with, where I said, well, let's consider where the risk is originating, which is sort of down the left-hand side, and let's consider where the risk is being experienced. And if we use those 3 categories of risks, or 3 types of risks, which I spoke about right at the start, it being strategic, operational, external, we can then create a matrix where we can see where it's relevant to the organization. So whether it's a risk of the strategy, a risk from the strategy, or to operations or from operations. When we're talking about these external risks, it's the dotted red line at the bottom. We're looking at a risk originating in the external environment that can impact our strategy and can impact our operations. Now, what I mentioned earlier is that because we have these cascading risks, you may even argue that you could have a risk manifest in the external environment impacting something else in the external environment, which would be that bottom right corner that's blank at the moment. So I haven't gone that far to identify that, but you can well imagine that this thing just sort of cascades and gets bigger. And this matrix is not necessarily there to advocate for you trying to work out a risk in every single block. That's not the logic of it. What it's trying to do is to say, when I take one of these lenses, what are the kinds of things I need to work on as the priority? And in this instance, it's, well, how can a change in the external environment with these uncontrollable risks impact our strategy, and how can it impact our operations? We may aggravate it through what we do, but largely this is, how is our organization impacted? And that's where you need to think through tackling these uncontrollable risks. When we move on to treatment, so we're making our way down that diagram, we've now got to identify the relevant responses. As I've mentioned, there's obviously controls where we're trying to stop things, but we're now getting to the realm of how do we respond to things? And so we're needing to ask the question, how do we respond to the uncontrollable risks that we face? And I'm going to default to the bow tie because for me, it's the easiest way to try and explain the logic. And interesting enough, the next slide will show you why it's even more important in this instance. But what we're trying to deal with is we have a risk that sits in the middle, and we're trying to understand what are the causes of that and what are the consequences, because we need to know where we need to put in the various controls. And if you look at what's available from the World Economic Forum, if you go and look at their data for their current report, you can get these basic bow ties already. And it's not getting into the controls, but it's trying to show you how, if our concern is extreme weather events, the causal factors are obviously critical changes to Earth systems, biodiversity loss, and what is meant by that is if you lose a wetland or something that can saturate and take up an extreme weather event, you lose, or you have a more severe weather event. Pollution makes it even worse. Non-weather related natural disasters. So if you have a volcanic eruption or you have a earthquake, all these things can make weather events even more extreme. And then you might even have frontier technologies. And this is where we're starting to see some conversations around, well, what happens when we get cloud seeding wrong? I mean, the recent storms in Dubai and even Saudi Arabia there's some debate around, has that been from our efforts around weather manipulation? So some of these sort of frontier technologies can have these impacts. It may also be where we've used AI and the like to try and determine how we should respond, and the information that we're getting out of those technologies not necessarily up to scratch yet, because it's based on our input into them. And then obviously the downstream impacts around natural resources, disruptions to critical infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a sense of when we are trying to understand the meta crisis or the interconnectedness of risks, you can see there are things that are upstream of what you're dealing with, and there are things that are downstream, and that's the same logic as you'd work when you are familiar with bow ties. The other thing where the benefit of the bow tie comes in is that when we think about our three different main control types, so whether it be a preventative control, whether it be a detective or monitoring control, or whether it be a corrective control, our focus is largely on the sort of the corrective control. So these are things where we are reacting to an event or we're recovering from an event. And so there's a big focus that we want to give to that when we're dealing with uncontrollable risks. So taking that diagram that I had earlier, we're now saying when we are dealing with the sort of the known, we would be focusing on known causes and consequences. As we have greater severity and more uncertainty, we're moving into the area of, well, we have some idea of the anticipated consequences, and then we need to be focusing on resilience, because we're now dealing with, we don't actually know how these things are going to play out, but let us put the measures in place that allow us to be resilient to these changes. So some organizations like to use this model where it's the same logic as you would have on your typical risk matrix of likelihood and severity, but all you've done is you've overlain your traditional risk treatment options. So when you know something to have a low severity and a low likelihood, you are quite tolerant of it. As the likelihood increases, this is where a lot of our focus is. This is where we like to mitigate risks. When we have higher severity and lower likelihood, this is obviously the realm of transfer, and this is where insurance plays a big role. And then when it's high severity and high likelihood, this is what we try and avoid. Unfortunately, what I've described today is that a lot of these things are unavoidable. We cannot control them. We can't go anywhere because these risks affect everyone. And so we're dealing with a completely different approach where it's almost an acceptance, but we have to think about it differently. But what we already have in the organization is when we have something that's typically a low severity, but a high likelihood. So the thing has happened. We're into the realm of remedying and resolving. That's traditional focus. It's almost incident management. But what we're needing to do is now sort of go beyond in terms of our resilience management. This is more than what we can do, and we are catering for low probability to high probability, or low likelihood to high likelihood. We're needing to sort of move into the sphere of resilience. And if we wanted to try and sort of map it, and again, here's another matrix where we're now needing to think about not just likelihood and consequence, or likelihood and severity. We're needing to think about the type of velocity and how it's playing out, and whether it's something that is acute. So bottom left, fast events where we have an acute shock, and then if they're longer term and they are slow, this is more of the sort of the chronic developments. Now, a lot of the work that's done in climate change at the moment, if you look at climate risk management, they make that distinction between acute and chronic risks. And this is what we're talking about here, is something that we need to respond to quite immediately, and something that has a longer duration and might be a slow burn. And then obviously the size is a distinguishing factor. So is it something small that we can focus on, or is it something large? And you can see the kinds of logic we can apply. And, you know, obviously the purple areas are very similar to our traditional incident management, encouraging some of the focus to not be just restricted to health and safety and not just information technology incident management. We're looking at things that are now starting to sort of make their way into our area of concern. And this might be, you know, we're going to need to think about what it is we're tackling here and evolve it over time. For the larger impacts, you know, this is the realm of the broader business continuity, from an emergency management response to a disaster recovery to business continuity and crisis management, if it's something that sort of makes the headlines and we feel that we need to protect our brand and the such like. But you can get a sense of what we're trying to do. This is typically more business continuity management than it is the realm of traditional risk management. And what we may well see, and this is sort of, I'm going out on a limb here a bit, but you might have already seen some of this kind of conversation if you think about the conversations that are held around black swans and the world of anti-fragile, which Nassim Taleb sort of advocates. I'm imagining a world where risk management needs to extend into the sort of this world of resilience and anti-fragility management. So it's a case of, if we know we cannot resist things and we've got some idea of how do we react, how do we adapt to this, how do we innovate? So how do these events make the business a stronger business than one that sort of ceases to exist because these events are so overwhelming? And, you know, that's the logic of going from robust to resilient to anti-fragile. And we're now getting a little bit theoretical, but I'm encouraging you to think in your realm of, as a risk practitioner, and if you're going to be working in this for the next 10, 20, 30 years, however it sort of plays out for you, I think that we're going to see risk management changing. But as you well know, each one of these areas is its own domain within organizations, and so they are probably going to want to sort of protect it in a sense, and we need to be aware of how do we integrate with them. And so I think this is a comment from Peter Drucker, who did a lot of work around, you know, foresights and futuring, and it's just saying the danger is not in the turbulence. The danger is in that we use yesterday's logic to try and tackle today's problems. And that's it. Are there any questions or comments? As I say, I'm going to drop the presentation, see if I can drop it into the chat. Otherwise, I'll have one of the rooms guys circulate it for you. So the question that's come up here is, can you can you expand on the risk assessment step? Is the matrix the best tool? The short answer is no. When you would have seen that as we're moving into a more sort of forecasting and foresight, we need to bring in a lot more quantitative risk assessment. The matrix is a useful tool in that everyone can have the same conversation, but it's poor from the fact that it can't cater for the richness of the conversation that needs to be had. And consequently, you're now getting into more stochastic modeling, probabilistic modeling, and you need a rich data set to do that. That doesn't mean you can't start off with a risk matrix, but you definitely needing to expand what you're dealing with. And you know, if you think about, we're dealing in the realm where insurance plays a far bigger role. This is where you will see actuaries sort of earn their bread and butter. They get into very sophisticated statistics to deal with some of these things. But as I've said, you can start off with the risk matrix. It's just not going to get you as far as you'd like to. I think we can still even deal with this as qualitatively. I think a scenario analysis, sort of plotting what this looks like, and some narrative around each one of those things will be hugely useful in the conversation. We don't necessarily need to just get into, well, what's the likelihood consequence? Because, you know, those things may be inadequate for what we're trying to do. I trust that answers the question. Next question, when heading into anti-fragility, can you provide some examples of what is required to move maturity from resilient to anti-fragile? Yeah, I mean, the examples that are often used are quite theoretical in nature. You know, the thinking is that the better I am able to respond to these things, the stronger I become. And that, you know, the example in Nassim Taleb's book might be something like, you know, bones are stronger because they have pressure on them. How do we translate that into the organization? I'm not entirely sure, but I think there are nuances that we're starting to see where if we have the services and sophistication to respond when systems are down or physical infrastructure is compromised, we can be far stronger. And I think the fact that we're using Teams and Zoom and those kind of tools are a clear example of people not being able to meet, but how do I provide a resource that allows them to continue to do things? That may be sort of looking at what anti-fragile might be. Next question. What techniques do you find most successful to bring senior leaders on the journey so that risk is prioritized in the business given current backdrop of our cost of living crisis and focus on operational excellence? Look, I mean, I think it's a difficult one because inherently anyone who operates at a senior level in an organization will already be factoring this into their thinking. And coming and dealing with them and trying to call this out as a you know, draw attention to it, make it more obvious, can sometimes be challenging for them from the point of view of they've already integrated into their thinking. So how best are you expecting them to respond? I think that sharing information and making them aware and maybe some bite-sized chunks around some of these trends or some of these observations might be very useful to highlight these things. Trying to overwhelm them with a lot of information is not the best way to go. So it's meeting them where they are and showing them how some of these trends can impact their functional areas within the business. Is it possible to think of key risk indicators that help to see those uncontrollable risks occurring? Look, I think what would be quite useful is if you think about the interconnected picture of some of those risks, whether you take the sort of the bow tie view, or whether it's your own bow ties or whether it's the WEF bow ties, or that interconnected picture that I showed in terms of the wicked problems. If you have metrics around some of those downstream things, you may well be picking up that some of these risks are starting to manifest. And so it would give an indication. I think the fact that we saw such strong responses around flexible working, I think was in response not only to people not being able to get into the office, but the fact that anxiety levels, so that the sort of societal anxiety levels, which are being posed as a current mega trend, the responses in terms of some of the things you've needed to put in place. So it might even be the controls. So you might call it a key control indicator, but in this instance, it's an indicator of something that's happened upstream. And that's where I'd be looking, is if I can think about what are those things downstream of the risk I'm concerned with and how I would track that. What would be my evidence to see that this is tracking, is where I would probably focus my attention, but it's very case specific. Next question, can we expect uncontrollable risk to manifest at all levels, i.e. enterprise, strategic level, tactical and operational? If yes, is the approach and manage them the same? I think largely they will manifest at all levels, but in different ways. And that would be quite an interesting thing to unpack. But I think it is, you can imagine if you think about, let's say, climate change as a concern. At a strategic level, you're probably thinking about, well, where would I have my assets? Is my product suite appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. Down at a very operational level, work that I did historically in the mine industry, operational level, they were looking at, well, what is the operating envelope of the machinery I'm using? At what point do my workers experience discomfort? So you've gone from something very strategic being, where do I want to operate, and will I have water for my operations, right down to what would it be like if it's very hot for my workers? So you could see this playing out differently, but you would probably need to manage them slightly differently. I wouldn't get hung up on how I would manage them, but just be appreciative of how it might manifest differently. This will be the last question. I'm just mindful of the time. With increasing complexities, do you see the use of AI as opportunities to help digest the multiple data sources, assuming we manage AI misinformation, hallucination instances? Well, that's a great question. And I will say that the example that the source that I got that information from, of all these reports, was actually advocating as to how you can use AI to take, so if you uploaded multiple reports, now obviously it's quite difficult because some of the content in that report will be pictures and infographics. And also it depends on, what access you have to AI, whether it's sort of the freemium version or the very sophisticated ones. What they were advocating is that you could almost dump the information in these AI models, ask for it to do some assessment and pick up what's the kind of themes coming through. When I worked in professional services, that was one of the things we did. We were almost doing narrative assessments. We'd take the content of risk registers and we'd analyze for similar terminology. Unfortunately, as we well know, a lot of people do cutting and pasting in risk registers. So it comes back to the garbage in, garbage out, as well as the biases. Each one of these reports, I was quite struck by when I must have I've read multiple reports for various clients, and I'm doing a piece of work at the moment where they're looking at other mega trends to consider. And you have a combination of there being an echo chamber where comments are repeated multiple times. So there's nothing sort of new under the sun. And then you have the opposite. Well, if person X says A, I'm going to say B, or anti-A. There's this sense of, let's think about the other extremes. And I would say that's not a bad thing, particularly when you're needing to look at optimism versus pessimism. There's some interesting trends starting to crop up where there's sort of pushback on responses. So pushback on how we respond to climate, pushback on EV adoption. They're all things that are almost counter positions, which we need to think about. Just looking, sorry, that's just a thank you presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and drop the presentation into the chat. If I don't have much success, I have no doubt that I'll share it with Kerry and she'll circulate it either directly or with one of her members in her team. So if you'll give me a second, I'm just going to see if I can do this. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to work. It may be quite large. I've put it in there, and we'll see whether people can access it. I'm hoping that's been very useful for you. I encourage you to join the other sessions. Some of this, there'll be some continuity from this one. Really helping, or really planning to help those of you who work as risk practitioners understand the sort of the organizational landscape and have a much better experience in the risk work that you do. So thank you again for your time this afternoon. Thank you to the RIMS team for assisting me. I look forward to catching up with you next month. Cheers, guys.